Everybody,
We will,
have a seat.
we'll have a few stragglers, but we would like to get started. I want to give you my 90-second highlight film of the first two classes. In class one, we established unequivocally that the world leadership of this region in oceanographic research and in marine technology and engineering expertise, there's no question about that. There's no comparable area in the United States or in the world that can match Southern California for the expertise in these areas. In class two, I think it was demonstrated that we are leaders in using our scientific knowledge of the Southern California ocean to protect coastal and ocean ecosystems with the designation of 50 marine protected areas. You can argue that it should have been 52 or 49, or they should have been larger or smaller, but we clearly are leaders. I think we also demonstrated it's difficult to make good policies, and it's even more difficult to implement good policies. And I think of all the statements that Richard Katz made, the ones I think were most relevant are that if we want to create the kind of political will to protect and to promote appropriate uses of the ocean, it will take a concerted effort in public education. And secondly, the public needs to agree with policymakers on what the problem is that you're trying to solve or the opportunity that we're trying to seize. And finally, in his words, protection, and then he used the word preservation, which is not a good word. You can't preserve anything in nature, but protection/preservation in most people's minds does not include responsible, sustainable uses. Now, tonight we're going to hear first from Don Kent, and he's going to tell us this story of a project that Hub SeaWorld Research Institute had to do aquaculture, finfish aquaculture off San Diego. And after $1 million in 18 months or so, without being able to get a yes or a no, he moved it to Mexico, and he's going to tell you that story. So he's one of these guys like Mitt Romney takes the jobs overseas. And Don has been the president of the Hub SeaWorld Research Institute since 1998. He went there in 1977 as a graduate student, working on the growth characteristics of striped bass. He's active in numerous civic and community organizations. He chaired the California Artificial Reef Enhancement Program. I learned tonight from Bob Grove that Bob Grove in Southern California Edison gave him $5 million. So far, Bob Grove has given the aquarium about $5. So there's a little discrepancy here, but and Don is one of the international leaders of advocating sustainable aquaculture. There's no question about that. He's an adjunct professor at San Diego State and a research associate at the University of San Diego. In 2007, he received the Stewardship and Sustainability Award from NOAA for his pioneering research on marine fish aquaculture and stock replenishment. And after we hear from Don, then we're going to hear from Joe Matthews. And Joe wrote this amazing book along with Mark Paul, California Crack-Up. And it's an analysis of what's wrong with California. So it's a diagnosis, but then there's a prescription of how we could correct this. I don't know how many of you read the lead editorial in this morning's Wall Street Journal, but it's worth reading. It's called Jerry Brown's Tax Cliff. And it says that the second most important election next Tuesday is the one that will take place here in California with Prop 30. I doubt if there's anybody in this room that doesn't believe that we need to invest more in education at all levels. The question is Prop 30 the way to do it? And I'm hoping Joe will comment on that. In this editorial, the point they try to make is that there are no guarantees the money will go to education and that it could have an adverse impact on California's competitiveness with other states and with other nations. So we're guaranteed, and I'll introduce Joe before he speaks. So we've got two very important people tonight, wonderfully rich topics and enough controversy to keep you all awake. And so, Don Kemp, please join me.
Thank you, Jerry. Whoa. Too loud? Sorry. Usually I don't use a microphone and needed all that. But anyway, I thought what I'd do first is talk a little bit about our institute. A lot of people don't know very much about it. It was dedicated in 1963 by Carl Levitt Hubbs, the gentleman on the right, Professor Emeritus in Marine Biology at SIO in La Jolla. And the gentleman on the left-hand side there holding those white sea bass is the founder of SeaWorld, a guy named Milt Shedd. And Milt was an avid fisherman, loved the idea of going out in Southern California and catching fish. And he's also a very strident conservationist and believed that it was important for good science to be done to promote good conservation. And that's why he wanted the institute to be formed and have the name Hub SeaWorld. Just a year before SeaWorld opened in 1964, the institute was established. The idea being that we'd be able to do research on the animals in the park and then benefit wild populations. And I'll describe a little of that work. We have research in 4 areas in ecology. These are different kinds of animals that we've tracked. We've got the world's largest whale shark tagging and tracking program. That's a Hawaiian monk seal in the upper left. We try to understand where these animals go to see why their populations are being impacted by human operations. There's something like 200 to 300 beached animals a year being collected by SeaWorld. These are animals that have become sick, they're on the beach, and whenever we can, we put a transmitter on them to track their post-release movements. An interesting case was when we had 2 or 3 hawksbill turtles that were actually confiscated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 30 years ago. And these turtles were kept in the collection at SeaWorld for over 30 years until we were able to do DNA analysis to determine they were from the Pacific stock. So we released the fish off, or the turtles off of San Diego here, and then you can see their tracks as they moved all the way across the Pacific Ocean. They did the entire Pacific Basin in less than a year to get back to the nesting grounds off of southern Japan, where they were born. So 30 years in captivity, and the first thing on their mind is, let's go make some baby turtles. So bioacoustics, the effect of noise on animals. You hear a lot about the Navy sonar is going to make all the whales go to depth. Helicopters are going to destroy the net catchers and the coastal habitat. And so we try to put hard numbers to that and get a better understanding of what potential impacts there are. A classic example of a program we undertook is by studying hearing in killer whales. We're able to determine why they were being attracted to vessels in Alaska that were backhauling their equipment. And killer whales are very acoustically oriented animals, and they have their peak hearing capability down here in this range, around 10 kilohertz. And if you look at over here, you can see the backhauling noise that's being made by the boats. And the idea here is that by understanding the stimulus going into the water and where the whales can hear it, all the animals had to do was get an association. They go over to that noise, they're attracted to it, they find fish there, all of a sudden, Pavlov's dogs. You've trained the whales to come to the food. So what we needed to do was see if we could extinguish that behavior. So we just taught the boats how to be quiet. And by dropping the noise coming out of the boat from 70 to 60 dB, we dropped the range. They could hear it from 18 kilometers to 5 kilometers. So instead of shutting the fishery down, or banning the use of, letting the fishermen shoot the whales, which is what they were doing, we basically solved the problem by studying the problem. So in aquaculture, the problem we have is that there's too many people on this earth, and we don't have enough fish to feed them all. And so what are we going to do about that? So back in the early 80s, we were approached by the sport fishing community, and they wanted us to see if we could replenish stocks of fish that had been depleted. So we chose the white sea bass. It's a member of the croaker family, like your spot-fin croaker, yellowfin croaker. Very large, goes to, I think there's a picture of it, and I don't have it on here. Record catch is 92 pounds for that species. Anyway, the idea here is that we would culture these fish and in our central hatchery in Carlsbad, California, and then distribute them to grow out sites along the coast. Now, this is something that's been recognized in the press for some time. All these articles in National Geographic, The Blue, and The Economist, we know there isn't enough fish in the ocean. We know that we're not going to be able to catch as many as we need. It's estimated that over 2/3 of the population of the fish in the world is either fully exploited or overexploited. And we need another 40 million metric tons a year if we're going to meet growing world demand. And that's demand as it is right now. That's not taking into account that certain economies are growing and they're going to be able to afford more seafood. So the only way to make up that difference is in farming and to make sure that our fisheries stay at a sustainably harvested level. And so one of the techniques we can use is to try to keep those populations up through aquaculture by putting the fish back out there. Now, how many of you are from Southern California originally? Okay. Do you remember the tuna industry we had here? Yeah. When we were kids, I grew up in San Diego, so we'd go down there to the Embarcadero and there'd be 2 or 3 tuna boats tied up. My wife, back here in the corner, grew up in Point Loma. She went to school with all the guys whose parents ran the tuna boats. And in the mid-70s, we had 16 canneries in Southern California supporting more than 10,000 jobs. And within 2 decades, we're down to 500 jobs. We have Bumblebee and Starkiss still in San Diego, but they're corporate offices. And now they're Bumblebee Foods. They're not Bumblebee Tuna, they own crack. I mean, they own all these different companies. It's about food now, it's not just about tuna. So we've seen a big change in our seafood industry here in Southern California. And this is just a quick look at what's gone on in California. Look over here on the far left, this is Eureka, what was caught in one year, 20,000 tons of production. Now, that's the highest yield here because they're harvesting Cancer Magister, Dungeness crab. So the harvest isn't as big as it is here in Los Angeles, but it's a lot more valuable. Down here, we're catching the squid, low value species, but a lot more of it. Okay? Here in San Diego, now remember, San Diego used to be the largest seafood port in the world. It's now down to less than 1,000 tons with $7 million of ex-vessel value a year. So we have all this infrastructure, embarcaderos, processing plants, skilled labor, boat docks, everything that we need to support a seafood industry except the seafood. And then this is what was made up of that 1,000 metric tons in value. Most of it was spiny lobsters. Swordfish was number 2. Sea urchins. We're talking about, tuna's not up there. Okay, what used to be the biggest reason that we were the hugest port in the world is now completely off the chart there. And now we're talking about sushi and high-end species here. So, another example of what's happened in fisheries along the West Coast. This is the capture of rockfish. And this is actually, excuse me, what is reported as red snapper or Pacific snapper. And you can see what happened between 1997 and 2007. Within 1 decade, we dropped from 50 million pounds a year to way less than that, maybe 1 million pounds a year. Now, that's a decade. And this is the entire west coast of the US. This is Washington, Oregon, and California combined. Now, you say, okay, well, we've got to lay off that fishery. Let's let it recover. The problem is it's not a fishery. It's actually 40 species of fish, some of which are already identified. These ones in yellow are identified as species that are already in need of recovery. So instead of one fisheries management plan to have this species come back, we need 40 fisheries management plans for one species or for one market type of fish, okay? One of the things I'd say is inherently, it's a lot easier to manage a farm in a fixed location than it is to manage 40 species across 2,000 miles of coastline. So, what's happened to the California economy? This is a report put out by National Ocean Economic Program, which is funded by NOAA. And between 1990 and 2000, we saw a net drop in 725 jobs. Now, this is after the loss of the tuna industry. Since then, So 1990 to 2000, 725 drops, about $40 million in lost wages and $160 million lost in the gross state product, about a 4 to 1. For every dollar in wages you have out there is about a $4 benefit to the economy. So, reasons for that. Diminishing the yield, there's fewer fish out there, you have to go further to get it. So your cost per yield is going up. More stringent fishery regulations, which are needed if we're going to maintain those stocks of fish over the long term. Development of marine protected areas is what a lot of people argue, but that's a necessary. I mean, these are management tools that are designed to try to keep the population up there. And skyrocketing fuel, 48% in 1 year in the cost of fuel. So you've got these guys sitting at the dock, boats sitting there, nets sitting on the boat. What are they going to do? You leave the dock, you're losing money. So, now overall, this is what's going on in our seafood supply in the country. This is the trade deficit in seafood. The deficit, not the total amount of import, but in 2006 it was upwards of $9 billion. Last year, I think the total imports were $14 billion and the trade deficit was closer to $11 billion. It's the second largest contribution to our trade deficit for natural resources that are imported. So in a country that takes pride in feeding itself, you know, we have the greatest agricultural economy in the world. California has the biggest agricultural economy in the world, California alone. And yet we can't feed ourselves when it comes to seafood. We get it from somewhere else. We get it from 85 or 50 different countries around the world. This is what's going on in the global side of things. And this isn't taking into account bycatch, fish that's caught and just thrown overboard because it's not live. Fish meal here in the yellow represents a fixed amount. Most of our forage fisheries like anchovies and sardines and herring and menhaden are actually fairly well managed on a sustainable level. What's nice about them too is they have short generation times, they repopulate themselves fairly quickly. And so we can manage those. This is what we think we can get out of wild fisheries in the catch for people here. And that's going to be locked in at about 60 million metric tons a year. And so if we look at population growth of the world and per capita consumption as it is now, and project it out over time, we need another 40 million more metric tons a year. Where are we going to get it from? We're going to have to farm it. So it's estimated that at a landed value of $3 a kilo, that's $125 billion. Using that 4 to 1 ratio, it's about $500 billion in global economy benefit. Now, this is just an example of where we get some of our seafood from. Jerry treated Joe and I and my wife to dinner tonight. We had tilapia. Now, this is where we get our tilapia from. We get it from all over the world. Now, we talk about carbon footprint. We talk about sustainability. A lot of people like tilapia because, well, it's a herbivorous fish. You don't have to feed it high protein diets. But we're flying it from Manchuria for crying out loud.
Don, the ones you had tonight were floaters in the tanks.
Oh, good. Good. Waste not, want not. That's good. Thank you. You'll excuse me while I go outside. Anyway. So,
just for point of interest, why don't you mention Costco and the salmon? I think that's very, the statistic was very interesting.
Costco, now, you've probably all heard that salmon is full of PCBs. Farm salmon is full of PCBs. Only wild salmon is clean enough for you, and it doesn't have omega-3 fatty acids. And they pump it full of artificial chemicals and to make it ready for you. Right? The reality is, farm salmon is just as good for you as wild caught. So I've caught wild salmon, and I've barbecued farm salmon. I have no problem going to Costco and feeding my family farm salmon. The only problem I have with it is it's probably coming from Chile instead of coming from the Pacific Northwest, where I think we ought to be growing. So we invented salmon farming in this country. Over 100 years ago, we started putting salmon back into the rivers so we could bring the population back up to where we wanted it. Unfortunately now, NOAA estimates anywhere from 60 to 70% of the wild catch of salmon actually comes from hatcheries. So that wild salmon that you're eating The Copper River Reds or whatever are probably coming from a hatchery anyway. So it's farmed salmon. The big difference is, imagine you release 1 billion salmon into the ocean and you get 1 million of them back. Say you get 10 million of them back, okay? What would that be, like 1% survival? That's not uncommon. Okay, well, Mother Nature did all the growth on those animals. All those billion salmon went out and started eating something the day they were released. And it wasn't until we got them back that we could say, well, here's our yield from that. But we just lost 90% of what we put out there. And everything that those salmon ate was lost. We had much more of an impact on the wild population of forage fish from those released salmon than we ever have from farm salmon. So, kind of got off the point there for a second. Anyway, the idea here is that what would a domestic industry do for us if we had a larger aquaculture industry? Now, we have huge catfish farms. We have huge trout farms. And we even have salmon in Maine and in the Pacific Northwest, in Puget Sound. But we don't have all the other species we could be buying. And they could grow. We would create jobs, we would create economic value. One of the things that's so harmful about a trade deficit is that's money that's leaving the country. It's money that's going out. It's paying somebody else to do something for us instead of paying our own people to do it. And, you know, back to your Mitt Romney reference, give you an idea that what we really need to do is take the fishermen whose boats are sitting at the docks now and give them a new way to bring fish to the dock. Remember I said, we've got everything we need except the seafood? This is the way to get the seafood. And we have the people that can grow it already available to take it on. So this is where our aquaculture comes from in the world. If we adjust production by surface area, you can see the U.S. with as big a land mass as it has, North America really isn't a huge contributor. It's actually down here, number 5 in the list. 80% of the farmed seafood that we have in the world right now comes from China and Asia combined. Now, one of the big concerns that the seafood industry has, and they have whole meetings on this now, and it's not biologists like me, it's economists that are telling them. What's going on is the middle class in Asia is growing. Right now, 25% of the world's middle class lives in Asia. In the next 25 years, 66% of the world's middle class will live in Asia. What's going to happen when those guys start saying, you know what, that shrimp we're sending to the US, why don't we just eat it ourselves? We can afford it. So all that seafood's going to stay there. What's going to happen when you go to Costco and that shrimp isn't available? What's going to happen when the Brazilian economy grows to the point that all the salmon that's grown in Chile now, 500,000 metric tons a year, is now staying in South America? We're importing 85% of our seafood now. What if it's not available? Now, I'm not an economist, but there's this, somebody in the office, or somebody in the room probably knows the supply and demand concept. What happens if the supply goes way down and the demand doesn't? The demand's up, the cost goes way up. So part of the concept of sustainability, in my mind, is that yes, the environment is critical. My dad grew up on a sugar beet farm in northern Utah. You don't poison the land. You do that, you're out of business. That's not sustainable. So you have to keep the land, you have to keep the resource viable. But it also has to be economically viable. And by that, I mean it has to be affordable to do, and it has to also feed more people. Sustainability shouldn't be about seafood for only the people that can afford it. It ought to be about making seafood that everybody can afford. The single mom with 2 kids that's looking at, you know, calorie count at Burger King and going, I'd rather feed the kids some seafood. Where am I going to get it? So this is how China grows seafood. This is not what we envision. I mean, imagine standing out here at the aquarium at the dock and looking out and you see something like that. That's not what we envision. The other thing that we have going on in China that's a little problematic, you may have heard the story about the melamine that was in the baby formula a year or so ago, a couple of years ago. It got into the seafood as well. So we need to grow seafood according to our standards, not just playing Russian roulette and saying, well, I'll buy wherever I can get it, and however you grow it is fine with me. But trying to test all that seafood that comes in for all the potential pollutants that might be there, or the chemicals that we haven't authorized to be used, makes the seafood that much more expensive and impossible to get. So by growing it by our standards, we're assured that the seafood will remain healthy and ready for folks to eat. Both the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy under the Bush administration, and just before that, the Pew America's Living Oceans report, both said that what we need to have is demonstration projects that will create a scenario whereby we can take a look at this, show people what it looks like, test the technology, and establish that it's a viable way to grow food in a manner that people will find acceptable. That's another component to sustainability, is that the technologies used are acceptable to the general public. This is the technology that's available to us. This is one type of system. These are polar circle cages. This is a typical salmon type operation, except these are growing tuna in Mexico. This is a salmon operation up in the Pacific Northwest. What we had proposed to do is put in a grid system, submerged 20 feet down, that would hold 24 cages. It would occupy about the area of 3 football fields on the surface. And then all of the rigging would be below water, on a sandy bottom 5 miles off the coast of San Diego. I'll show you the chart. This farm right here would have the capacity of growing 3,000 tons of seafood a year, or 3 times what the annual catch being brought into San Diego is right now. Well under what we used to bring in for tuna, but at least a start, and it would be a demonstration. If we took the per capita consumption of California, 15 pounds per person, times 37 million people, which is I think the population of California, we eat 277,000 metric tons a year of seafood just to feed Californians. Where are we going to get it from? Now, a lot of people say the technology doesn't exist, it's too risky. I disagree. This is a picture of the Mediterranean. This is a report from the FAO. It was actually a study done to verify fish production in the Mediterranean using Google Earth. So this was the graphic in the presentation. And it shows all the fish farms in the Mediterranean. And this is a typical fish farm. Now this is much closer to shore than anything we'd want to do. We'd want to have everything much further out. But the point is all 16 countries surrounding the Mediterranean are actively involved in fish farming. And nobody's going to tell me that Monaco or southern France or Italy is any less concerned about its ocean environment than we are. So what we do in our laboratories is we have a hatchery operation uses an intensive approach to culturing fish. That is, we do a lot of fish in a small area. And this is the primary species. I told you the whites, so that's the record catch. That was actually caught by a spear fisherman off of, out here, I think near Newport, a couple of years ago. 92, 94 pounds, something like that. But they all start out like this, about a quarter of an inch long. And then I talked about our cage operations. We have 13 cage operations. This is where our hatchery is. And we have cages backside of Catalina and up and down the California coast. So we take our juvenile fish, put them in the cages, grow them out to 10 or 11 inches. They're all tagged so we know how they're surviving, and then we release them. This is our cage operation. We got a funded program from NOAA to take a look at a pilot scale operation on the backside of Catalina Island. So if you've ever been over to Cat Harbor and know where the Coast Guard cutter ties up, it's like right over here, this is our setup. We have 3 cages, or 4 cages, 30 by 30 by 20 feet deep, that we can grow white sea bass in. That's the location of it. It's protected against harsh weather, except we had an El Nino that year and the waves came in like this, but it stood up to that just fine. Anyway, the results of that program, we reached marketable size in 18 months, 97% survival, 0 escapes, the excellent quality. In fact, a separate study done by the Oaks and Fundella from the Occidental Group reported that the net cages actually created more productivity on the reefs, the natural reefs under the cages, than on the surrounding reefs around it. So there wasn't an adverse impact to the environment. There's actually an enhancement of the environment. I don't like using that term, but the idea is fish weren't dying around it. They were actually hanging out around it. They liked the habitat. They liked what it did. So what we propose to do is permit and operate a commercial scale fish farm in federal waters, assess the ability to create a domestic supply of seafood, and basically put San Diego and California in a leadership role for this for the nation, going out into the open ocean, using parts of the ocean that we haven't used before. So site requirements. Now, it's funny because Jerry, how long ago was it that we had that workshop here?
I think it was either 2008 or 9.
Yeah, at least 4 years ago,
Right.
I think. Jerry called in a bunch of people, the folks from Squirt, some of the aquarium guys and everything. We all sat around the table, so what's it going to take to do aquaculture off the coast? And we went to a map on the wall, and we just drew, okay, this is where you can do it. And we're 5 years later, and we're still not there. We've got marine spatial planning, but we really don't, nobody's really put anything down on paper yet. So our needs were between 100 and 300 feet of depth, clean water with a current. What's great about Southern California is we've got predictable water temperature. We don't have extreme weather here. I mean, 15-foot wave or 15-foot swell is really uncommon, but the equipment that we would use is capable of handling 30-foot seas. We want to avoid user and habitat conflicts, so sort of a marine spatial planning in microcosm, and close to existing infrastructure. So we looked at up and down the coast. This is all the way up in Santa Barbara Channel. Let's see, the Santa Monica Bay, right off at the coast here, and then 2 spots in San Diego. And we finally hit on this. This is Mission Bay here, San Diego Bay, back in here. We wanted to avoid this area, because that's where the Navy has a lot of operations. This is the coastal zone, so we wanted to be out in federal waters. So we picked this spot right on the 300-foot contour, 5 miles out of Mission Bay. Our laboratory sits right here. And we avoided kelp and sandy bottoms. And then we went to the fishing community and we said, guys, where do you fish? This is where we want to put it. Now, the problem we have with marine spatial planning is that everything that you want to do in the ocean is going to be site-specific. It's not like you're going to walk out and go, yeah, this whole area right here is for aquaculture. Because as soon as you say that, and you can say, well, this is where I want to put my farm, you're going to have to start the whole process of reviewing everything anyway. So marine spatial planning really doesn't get you down the road. Because you end up having to do it for the project anyway. You have to go and talk to all the different user groups and find out if there's a problem or not. So we wanted to avoid this area because there's a lot of traffic in and out of San Diego Bay. But here, anybody going up the coast out of Mission Bay comes out and hugs the coastline. Anybody wanting to go over to Catalina goes inside of this, or to San Clemente Island goes outside of that. So really, it's a very unused part of the ocean. Except when we got in front of a bunch of fishermen, he said, where do you want to put that? That's exactly where I go after my Bokashi. And we said, well, what can we do? And he said, well, if you move it a quarter mile, we said, fine, it's moved a quarter mile. It's no big deal to us. I mean, it's the sand bottom and everything's pretty much the same a quarter mile south as it was there. And then San Diego really had everything we needed. If this is the farm site 5 miles out to sea, 12 miles away are 2 commercial basins where fishermen offload their product for processing. So what we're talking about is basically putting a new source of fish in the existing supply chain that's already there, that's already been paid for. We've already paid for the docks, the processors are there. All we need to do is put new product on the dock for these guys to work with. So, you probably all heard about the concerns of aquaculture. Using fish to feed fish, impacts of escapes on wild stocks, polluting the bottom, spread of disease, competition with fishermen, farm domination of the offshore environments. I'll do a few examples of some of these. We've actually developed, this is something that's gone on in aquaculture. In the last 20 years, the production in aquaculture has gone up 14-fold from where it was 20 years ago. And yet, the harvest of fish meal has stayed constant. And that's because we've gotten better and better at growing fish. One way we've done that is we use vegetative protein instead of fish meal protein. We now have diets we've developed that don't use any fish meal in them at all. Another technique we're using is to take byproduct. After you fillet a fish, what's left over? You got the head, the guts, the backbone, grind it up, mix it with some soybean, you got a diet to grow a fish. And that ground of fish was going to go into the trash heap. So now you're turning it into another fish. And you haven't taken a sardine out of the ocean. We had a meeting yesterday with a group from the Imperial Valley that's running spirulina. They want to take spirulina algae and use that as a dietary source of protein for the fish. So the problem is we keep working on solutions to problems, but we don't have an industry that's really going to utilize them yet. So we're having a bunch of solutions in search of a cause, of a problem. These are all the species that we're capable of working with. We're able to reproduce. We've closed the culture cycle on all these species that are common to Southern California: halibut, California yellowtail, white sea bass, striped bass. The cage system I told you about earlier. So we did some modeling. There's some guys in Puget Sound area, and one of their affiliates is at University of Southern Cal out here. And they've developed this aqua model that looks at the production of metabolites from farms and looks at the hydrography of the area, the sand type, the aerobic and anaerobic processes that go under the cages, and basically sit and predict what will happen to a cage at a given location growing a certain tonnage of fish over time. And so we went out and we bought a $30,000 Doppler sonar device to plot the current flow at the location we wanted. This is the current at different depths. And then we turned around and threw it loose on the model. And what they found is that nitrogen, phosphate, sediment, carbon on the bottom, you wouldn't even, you get 10 feet away from the cage, you wouldn't even be able to detect the cages there because the flow of water is so consistent that the metabolites are diluted immediately. So there's no chance of an algal bloom, there's no chance of the bottom going anaerobic. So back to that idea of what we do in California right now. This is back to the idea of space utilization in the open ocean. So three county areas, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, and San Diego, total harvesting something like 100,000 metric tons a year. Now remember, San Diego is only about 1% of that. Collectively, all of California is about 150,000 metric tons. But say San Diego, or just Southern California alone, these three counties. Now, we have about 19,000 square miles of Southern California area that people fish in. That 100,000 metric tons was worth $59 million for a total value of about $3,000 per fish square mile of yield. If we were to do this, if we were to take the same 100,000 tons of production, and remember that's mixed in with anchovies and squid and a bunch of low-value species, but if we were to take that same production and do it in aquaculture and put all the farms so they were several miles apart from one another, you'd have 20 farms doing about 5,000 tons each, and collectively they would take only that much space out of 19,000 square miles. And the value generated at $6 a kilo, which is low, would be about $30 million per square mile and support about 4,000 jobs, fishing jobs in Southern California. Now, compare that to what's going on with, I think one of the subjects you guys discussed is marine protected areas. These were the existing protected areas in Southern California before they added several more. And any one of these is larger than that 20 square miles. So, I'll give you an example. My wife and I had some sushi for lunch, and she loves hamachi. You guys know what hamachi is? California yellowtail. Okay? There's Japanese yellowtail and California yellowtail. They can both be served as hamachi. All of the hamachi you will eat in a sushi bar is farmed. If it's not farmed, the quality of the wild caught isn't good enough because it's by the time it gets in the boat and it's harvested, there's too much lactic acid built up in it. So the whole idea behind this is that it has to be harvested, killed, bled perfectly so that the flesh stays the consistency that the sushi chefs want. So we estimate there's about 50,000 metric tons a year of hamachi sold in the U.S. Now remember, there's only two species that will fill that market. the Japanese yellowtail and the California yellowtail. And the California yellowtail only exists in the US and California. So here's a native species at 15,000 metric tons a year. At $12 a kilo, that's worth $600 million from one species to meet an existing market demand. That's $600 million we could keep in this country if we just grew it here instead of buying it from Japan and Australia. About 2,000 seafood jobs, $1.2 billion contribution to the gross state product. And we've quadrupled the ex-vessel value of all the seafood landings in all of California. So we're talking about taking this existing seafood industry and with one species, quadrupling the total revenues and jobs generated with that one species. So what limits us? Now this is an idea of what it is, salmon. Remember, we've been doing salmon for over 100 years. And we just basically gave the industry away to other countries because we wouldn't do it here. This is what a salmon farmer in Washington State has to go through. These are all the permits he has to pull. And this is to grow fish that they already have in Washington. And 80% of the existing market for salmon is farmed. So all we're doing by making this harder for farmers is to force the market somewhere else. It's estimated, I think there's a number on the next slide, that Chilean salmon we buy, $120 million a year in airfare. So when you're buying that salmon, you're paying to fly it from Chile up to here. So even if it is a little more expensive to grow it here because of labor, we got $100 million, $120 million to play with in the profit margin. Okay? So what if we wanted to take, because the Brazilians are going to buy all of the farmed salmon in Chile, what would it take for us to duplicate that? We import about 324 billion pounds. Air freight costs are 160 billion. I'm sorry, I underestimated. Foreign companies earn $130 million that could have gone to U.S. companies. So if we replaced all the imports with net pens in Puget Sound, it'd take about 0.5% of the surface area available, about 0.06 of the surface area available. Excuse me, this is leased acres, I'm sorry. You'd need more leased area than the actual surface area. So it's about 1/10 of the leased area is actually what you see on the surface. Take a capital investment of $836 million plus working capital and have 2,000 jobs generated. And this was generated by a friend of mine at Icicle Seafoods. To give you a corresponding level of investment, Tyson Foods spent $643 million on capital expenditures to produce more chicken in 2011. Soybean farmers have 77 billion acres under cultivation right now. And the U.S. poultry industry produced 47 billion pounds of broiler chickens. So we're a farming economy. We're just talking about applying it in a different way to generate a domestic supply of seafood grown the way we want it grown and keeping the jobs and the revenues in this country. Now, when we went to permit our project, how am I doing on time? 5 minutes?
10.
10, okay. So when we went to do our project, this is our permitting process that we were required to go through. And actually all the agencies were pretty cooperative. Army Corps of Engineers was ready to go, the EPA was ready to go. But really what kills you in this country is NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, which basically says that, well, we're going to start a process, and that process says, yeah, go for each individual permit, but then what we're going to want to see you do is all those permits get opened up as a package for public review, which I think is fine. But should it take 2 years and over $1 million to do it? So, and then on top of that, our coastal commission said, well, we want to certify it. Now we're 5 miles out to sea, we're outside the coastal zone, but the coastal commission wants to lay its hands upon it and bless it, okay? So, and that's fine, I mean, they have a responsibility, but they actually wanted to start their review process here after all the rest of it was done. So they wanted to add another whole year to the thing, instead of doing it concurrently. No, we want to touch it last. And the only thing is, if they change anything, then it's got to start back over again from the beginning. So, The problem we have right now is that we've developed this technology. We've got disease management. We've got new species that nobody else has ever cultured before that represent the potential for a new industry. Jobs, domestic supply of seafood, lowering the trade deficit. And the only people that are really interested in permitting the culture of these fish are the Mexicans. Now, there were 8 tuna farms in northern Baja. Now, because, what they do in tuna farming is they go out and catch small bluefin tuna or yellowfin tuna and then fatten them up and then harvest them like I was saying we harvest the yellowtail in a very specific way so that the flesh is primo for the market in Japan. And what they'll do is they'll harvest it in the morning, drive it to LAX, and it's in Narita, Japan, 20 hours after it's harvested, getting $75 a pound. And that's what drives this industry right here. But they can't catch enough bluefin to put in their cages. And white sea bass and yellowtail aren't as valuable, but they can get them. So they have all this infrastructure. They're sitting here going, we've already permitted it, let's grow the fish the Institute can grow and put them in our cages. There's one group we're working with right now off of Isla Santa Tomas, or Todos Santos. You know where Ensenada, if you look off Ensenada, there's these 2 islands out there. There's a farm run by a group called Pacifico. Well, Pacifico is a wholly owned subsidiary of Atlantis Seafood, which is an Icelandic company. The 2 guys that run Pacifico actually live up here in LA. They're old tuna fishermen. Their farm manager is a guy they hired from Australia. And the money they're using is from Japan. Okay? And guess where they're going to sell the seafood? So we've created the technology. They're actually testing our soy diets for us right now. We're giving them the soy diets too. So everything we've learned how to do is now being applied in Mexico. And guess where they're selling the fish? They're selling it at Santa Monica Seafoods off the coast here. So, and the quality of the product is outstanding. I've taken the entire NOAA aquaculture office down to see this operation. And they served us lunch of the striped bass we've been growing in cages down there. They go crazy for it. It's fresh, it's clean, it's got a marvelous taste, and they're getting $10 a kilo for it. They're getting the prime price for it. And it's all based on what we learned how to do. Your tax-paying dollars at one. You know, I work for a nonprofit. We do all this for NOAA grants, Cal Fish and Game grants, Soybean Association grants. So the whole idea is let's create an industry here. But then we get all dressed up and we've got no dance to go to because we can't get the permits to do the work. Yeah. So what I estimated was going to take $1 million to $1.5 million in 2 years to get permits here. I went for a 3,000-ton operation. I got in 6 weeks, I got a 10,000-ton permit in Mexico. Mexico wants to see it happen. The water's just as clean as we have it. There's no marine mammals getting crowded up in it. There's a video. If Jerry, I'll send the link to the video to you, and you can send it to the class. It's the guys that are doing the work down there. It's the soybean folks. It's Santa Monica Seafood and Mark Drawbridge from my lab, all being interviewed about what this looks like. There's harbor seals swimming around there. It's just a happy little world down at Todos Santos Island with all these fish swimming around in the ditch. So, all that stuff I showed you in the beginning, killer whales, sea turtles, everything else, I work for a research institute that's about conservation, about making sure that the animals in the ocean and the humans on the land get to live together. I don't want farming to happen at the cost of the environment. That's not what sustainability is about. I work for a conservation research organization, and we believe that farming is the way we're actually going to conserve the ocean, not overexploit it. A recent report put out by World Fish and published by Conservation International states that aquaculture has, from an ecological efficiency and environmental impact perspective, clear benefits over other forms of animal-sourced food production for human consumption. It's comparing chickens, pigs, beef, all the animal-related sources of protein that we might eat, including commercial fishing. In view of this, where resources are stretched, the relative benefits of policies that promote fish farming over other forms of livestock production should be considered. This is the most ecologically sound way to produce protein for a growing world population is to do it in the ocean or do it in water with these fish that are naturally more efficient protein converters than any other kind of domesticated species that we currently consume. With that, I'll leave you with a couple of quotes. Jacques Cousteau back in the 70s said, "We must learn to farm the sea as we have farmed the land." And President Barack Obama, in his address to Congress in February of '08, his first address to Congress, "I do not accept a future where the jobs and industry of tomorrow take root beyond our borders. It's time for America to lead again." So my final comment would be that California is very much a leader in the development of technologies, but it's very much a laggard in the application of those technologies to the benefit of the economy and to the citizens of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, and the irony is that if you look at different state policies in California, offshore aquaculture is identified as a legitimate, appropriate use. And yet we can't get permits. The permitting processes lack transparency, predictability, and it's like the old Karnak the Magnificent routine on Johnny Carson. You can't get an answer. It's not yes or no. There's just no answer. And they drag it out and out. And now, you said coastal and marine spatial planning doesn't get us there. It hasn't so far. But, you know, we for the first time in this country, have a national ocean policy, July of last year, when the president signed this. We have a Congress that has, the House has said that no federal agency shall spend $1 on implementing the national ocean policy, because that's not the nation's, it's the president's. And in that policy, it identifies coastal and marine spatial planning as a major tool that should have environmental, economic, and social benefits to the nation. And it's really, it's a crazy world.
Jerry, the concept of marine spatial planning makes sense. When we built our hatchery in Carlsbad, the land that we built it on was set aside for aquaculture. We had 5 acres. And in the coastal management plan for Carlsbad, they said, we want aquaculture on this site. So what that meant is when I went in to get my permit, I could get a mitigated negative declaration instead of have to perform a complete EIR. The city had already run it by the Coastal Commission saying, this is for aquaculture, which Jerry points out is a legitimate use, a recognized use of the coastal area. Now, if marine spatial planning actually had the authority to do that, the president said, you guys, this is where we're going to have wind farms, this is where we're going to have commercial fishing, this is where we're going to have lanes for travel, for commerce, this is where defense needs to be, and this is where we're going to have aquaculture. And that actually carried some authority, such that when I go to get a permit to do this, all of a sudden that 2 years gets cut down to 6 or 7 months. I'd say there's a reason to participate in this. But my only point is that we'll spend years pulling that plan together, and what it comes down to is it doesn't supersede NEPA, so you'll still have to do it all over again. Now, one other thing about California is that about 6 years ago, Senator Simidian passed a law about aquaculture development, and it called for the development of programmatic EIR. That is basically, here's your environmental roadmap that you have to follow. If you want to propose something to do farming, this is what you have to follow. We're 6 years later, we don't have the PEIR done. So what they did was they created a legislative roadblock that basically said, you've got to do this first. It makes sense to do it. It's sort of like what I said about putting the hatchery in. Here's what our concerns will be, answer these, and you can go do it.
And at that meeting that you mentioned that we had in 2008, we called for the completion of the PEIR, the Programmatic Environmental Review. It's something that could be done in 6 months. And here we are, we still haven't.
6 years later, and it's just been bounced between agencies and nobody's got it.
And it's really unfortunate because California, we have this wonderfully large state waters, the EEZ off California. We've got productive, it's rich in natural resources, renewable living, non-living, and we don't seem to be able to get out of our own way. And the permitting process is the biggest obstacle. And yet there's no place that can match our scientific, technical expertise.
We have a competitive edge in our technology, But there's nothing that we can't grow, that we can grow in California that they cannot grow in Mexico. So we lose that competitive edge and that proximity to market. We have 12% of the US population living in California. We've got half of that living in the coastal zone between Point Conception and San Diego. So that's a huge market that we could meet. You know, imagine your fish is coming from 5 miles right out there on Tuesday, and Wednesday it's sitting on your plate. We lose that because we can't get the permits, but Mexico can, so they get the business.
Joe's gonna have all the answers to all these questions in just a couple of minutes. So, we talk about science and policy, that we want scientifically sound policy, or we want science to inform policy. And that's a tough case to make. If you ever remember the old proverb that it's hard to find a black cat in a dark room, especially if there's no cat in the dark room. And it is the world of science to look for black cats in dark rooms, often and usually not knowing if there's any black cat there. Scientists live in the world of ignorance because they want to find out things that nobody ever knew before. Policymakers, they want certainty, and they want to look for black cats in white room, in brightly lit rooms. And there's this terrible mismatch between scientists and policymakers, and often scientists aren't the best people to talk about the implications of science and policy unless they have translators that can really put it into a very different language. Now, before I introduce Joe, would anybody want to ask Don a question? Yes, go ahead.
Actually, I have a question. Have you seen any results of actually changing the diet of the fish by using like plant proteins?
Well, actually, we did a really interesting study. We took and grew our California yellowtail, which is, you know, out of all the species, probably the most sensitive, the most delicate, and we grew them on a 100% soy diet up to 3 pounds. And we compared that with a regular fish meal diet. And then we sent the fillets up to testing, the USDA-approved testing laboratory in Washington, run by the University of Washington. It's one of these blind tasting situations. And the results came back that they couldn't differentiate between the quality of the fillets. So the taste quality was the same. And it's a relatively common practice in farming to use other types of feed and then use a finishing diet to get the flavor you want. But we found we didn't even have to do that. Now, right now that's being tested on a cage level scale in New Mexico. That same diet is now being applied to 8,000 fish that we have in a cage down there. So in a year, we'll come back, we'll have some hamachi, and you guys tell me whether it's good. Okay?
Anybody else have one? Val?
We are talking about science here, and I'm wondering if you've considered the impact of the election coming up one way or another, if you think it's going to have a serious impact on you.
Well, I'll tell you that what's going on, and you know, the latest thing I read in Science was actually from, it was in Science, an editorial basically saying the sequestration process. What's happened is universities and research organizations like ours live and die off of competitive grants. We go out and we compete with other researchers for the best ideas to get. And so there's competitions. They'll put out an RFP for a proposal, and then all the best guys will get together and they'll put something together and they'll propose it. It gets peer reviewed. But if there's no money to put into those programs, the first thing that goes from the federal budget is discretionary spending, where all those competitive programs come from. So the first 10% off the top of the budget resulting from the sequestration process will wipe out the availability of competitive grants across the board. We're talking about defense, health, medicine, biology, everything. And so, I don't think it's so much who's going to win the election as these guys have to grow up and quit being like they're in kindergarten anymore and run the freaking country, because they're not getting any work done in Congress. And the sequestration process is the direct result of a couple of hardliners on both sides say, well, we're going to push that decision off, and then not dealing with it when they did. Yes, sir.
You know, it's kind of a wonder that back in Arkansas, you got these pig farms with these waste receptacles that leach into the rivers and smell and all that sort of stuff. But they're an established entity. They're bought by politicians. So emerging entities, especially nonprofits, they don't have the money to go out and, support the re-election efforts of a local politician.
Yeah, the reality is, right now, when I go and talk to an investor and I say, I need $2 million to go get the permits and it'll take me 2 years to get them, and we're getting all of our seafood from somewhere else, he goes, well, then grow it somewhere else. To the guy that's buying the seafood, he's already buying it from Mexico. So he doesn't want to invest in a 2-year permitting process. He'll say, go get the permit in Mexico and I'll buy your fish from down there.
I think particularly if you don't know that you can get to yes.
Yeah.
If you knew that after a year and a half you could get to yes, that would be different.
And at the year and a half is just when the lawsuits start. Once you have the permits, then people start suing you.
One more.
No, I saw your, the tuna pens and the purse-sagers off Baja this last summer.
Mhm.
They were doing great. We
Yeah,
ran
and
two big pens.
I'm not a big supporter of the tuna farming just because when you look at how they do it, the bluefin population has already got some issues.
Right.
And the way they feed those guys is they go out and catch a bunch of anchovies. It's inherently inefficient. And what's nice about this type of aquaculture we're talking about is we're starting with fish that wasn't going to be in the ocean anyway. We grew it ourselves through our own brood stock. So we didn't affect the wild population. We created our own fish to put in that
And
cage.
it really is an aquaculture.
It's sea ranching type of thing, yeah.
But I have heard that there are experiments with ranch.
There are people trying to do it, and there's, in Japan, yeah, they're spending tens of millions of dollars. It's really where the industry is going to have to go. One more question.
I'm just curious, what do you think will happen with our inflation and our drought and the corn ability to feed cattle and everything to the demand for seafood?
Cattle are inefficient.
What?
Cattle are extremely inefficient.
But the point is we're not going to have cattle, so we're going to need more of something else. And I mean, that's the other part of it too. All these grains are getting more expensive. So I'm kind of excited about this idea of spirulina. We can go out to the desert, we can grow that in big ponds, and then.
But the other thing I would underscore is many of it, as Don already said, many of the objections to aquaculture, they're 10 to 20 years old, and they're still the ones that are used, and they're no longer valid. We know how to deal with all of these issues. And there are farms, for example, now in Maine, salmon farms, where they have TV cameras under the nets, and as soon as any food drops through that cage, it shuts off the automatic feeding because the farmer's wasting money by letting it fall to the seafloor and then decay and release nutrients and consume oxygen. So it's really important. And Joe, I'm sure this is hard for you to believe. This kind of thing can happen in the state that you described in this book. So Joe Matthews is the California editor of Zocalo Public Square. He's a fellow of Arizona State University Center for Social Cohesion. He is the co-author of this book that I highly recommend. This is a wonderful book. He also wrote The People's Machine, Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Rise of Blockbuster Democracy. That was in 2006. He's a lead blogger at NBC's California site Prop Zero. He's an Irvine Senior Fellow at the New American Foundation, and he's written for the LA Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, the American Prospect, Scientific American, it goes on and on. He's clearly a very distinguished journalist. Did you read the Wall Street Journal editorial?
I did. I'm a Wall Street Journal subscriber, married to the Wall Street Journal's National Health Care Report, so I have to read it every day.
Let's welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. You got this great. Everyone here all right? Thank you so much. I puzzled it. I'm honored to be here. I'm actually literally here because of Long Beach. My grandparents on my father's side sort of met and courted at Russell's Hamburger Stand across the street from Wilson High School. My father was born and spent most of his childhood here in Long Beach. And we came here by sea. The Navy made my great-grandfather get out of Yantai, China, in fact, and make his way here I'm no expert on the oceans, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about California governance, and I think that First Talk really sets up a conversation about what's wrong with California, what's the biggest problem in California, and I think that wonderful talk is an example of it. I mean, some people, when you ask that question, say, the schools, prisons, healthcare, the budget, the economy, traffic. There are a lot of answers. Maybe the environment. Water is a big subject for the state as well. I spent 10 years as a reporter in the state, covering all sorts of different kinds of stories, and I became convinced over that time that the biggest problem in California is that we have all these problems. We know there are things we need to move on, but our system of government doesn't permit us to take the kinds of actions that we need to be able to take. And that's where I came to writing this book with a colleague, Mark Paul, a former deputy treasurer of the state, was involved in partisan politics, was the policy director for Phil Angelini's campaign for governor as a Democrat in 2006. I am completely unsuited for public service and have no interest in campaigns or campaign politics, at least as a participant. I prefer to throw my spitballs from the back of the room most of the time. But the two of us, and we're very different people. Mark is from the Midwest, I'm from here. Mark is about 25 years older than I am, one of those narcissistic baby boomers. I'm one of those diffident Gen Xers. We're very different people, but we came to that conclusion about the biggest problem in California, and also came to this from a shared frustration. We both obviously, Mark also had a media background, and I spent my career working in the media. As you've heard, I worked for every dying print publication in a very short amount of time. And that is, the frustrations were two. One, I think, is that frustration that all Californians feel. Maybe they can't express it, maybe they feel it because about the particular issues they care about, but that there are these things that need to get done, or there are ideas, as we heard, that could be acted upon that make a lot of sense, and it's impossible to get action, to get an answer in our system. And then I think Mark and I had a second shared frustration connected to our time in the media, and I felt it very strongly that I was part of the problem, that I thought I did a pretty good job of getting the facts of the stories that I wrote as an LA Times reporter for many years right. But the underlying narratives, the sort of stories that are the assumptions that undergird the stories, that undergird my stories, were wrong. Because they had once been true and had grown outdated, or because in some cases they had never been true to begin with. And as I thought more about this and saw evidence of my own error, I began to want to try to fix those narratives, to create a different kind of narrative that was more complete and more accurate. All of those sort of false narratives are very much alive with us, and this is a great time to talk about them because they are all over your television screens and on your radio right now. Particularly when we have elections in California, particularly when we have big elections about ballot initiatives, you hear these arguments. And if you listen to any ad, you boil down to the stories you're being told in the ad. Almost every story you're being told is a story of blame. There are people out there, they can change from ad to ad, but they are politicians, they are the legislature, they are the governor, they are public employee unions, they are corporations, they are rich people who are greedy, they are poor people who are greedy, they are special interests, and the list goes on, but somehow they are doing things, they are too powerful, and if we could just get control of them, whichever flavor of villain you prefer, we would be okay. Now, almost any of the special interests and folks that receive blame, I could explain to you how they are partly to blame for the fix we're in. But none of those interests, none of those entities really is fully to blame. And the people who actually deserve the most of the blame never get blamed because they're the audience for the ads. And if you want to meet those people, look in a mirror. It's you. And I mean that profoundly. In no other state in this country have voters been more the authors of their system. This is a profoundly different place. It's not governed like the other 49 states. It is still, as the great writer Terry McWilliams called it, what is still the best book ever written about California. My book is only the second best book. California, the Great Exception, which has never gone out of print and is worth picking up. It's a beautiful read, and except for the numbers in it about population and a few other things, it reads like it was written yesterday. But this is a great exception, a state that has had a different kind of history, and that is true of governance as well. So if you don't buy the narratives, what should the new narrative of California be? What's really going on here? What's gone wrong? Now, before I tell you that story, let's do a little history, the 5-minute version of California government and constitutional history, 1849 to the present. We essentially have created the California government that we have today in 5 waves, 5 moments, some very extended, one of them currently ongoing. That first moment was when we first tried to design a state government account, a real system of government. It was 1849, 50 guys. Emphasis on guys, that'll be a recurring theme. Get together in Monterey. They're convened by no particular authority. It's a military governor, the 7th and last military governor of California, soldier from Maryland, says, maybe we should have some sort of constitution in case California becomes a state. So these guys who list all sorts of professions but were really miners looking for gold come quickly together. They are in a hurry to leave from the very beginning and get back to looking for gold. And so what do? They take the Constitution of Iowa, because it's the shortest and one of the most recently approved, and they copy it. And then they start to take out all the things that explain how you pay for government. They actually had a committee, a subcommittee of this first entity, and in that subcommittee, they were asked to report on how were we going to start a state government, where would we get the money to do it, and the committee essentially reported back as follows: look, most of the people here are poor. There's no way to get any money out of them by taxing them. Those who are rich, their wealth is in gold. It's going to be hard to get money out of them. In fact, we're not going to have the money we're not going to be able to hire tax collectors in this area because people all want to be looking for gold. So let's punt. Let's borrow as much money as we can, and maybe when we become a state, Washington will help us out. And as you can see, we've evolved incredibly in our thinking in 162 years. That document was so defective, that original document, that there were immediately attempts to change it, immediately attempts to call a new constitutional convention. 3 of those failed. In 1878, finally, the voters agreed, after a request from a very new labor-dominated party from San Francisco, came to power in 1878, late 1878, but another constitutional convention. That was a very war-torn group, a lot of bitter fighting. The one thing they really agreed on was that the problems of California were primarily the fault of the Chinese. And so we got entire articles of the Constitution devoted to discrimination against the Chinese that were a problem for American foreign policy for 50 years. That group spent a lot of time fighting. They put one of the delegates from Santa Barbara on trial for a couple of weeks because they didn't like him, a trial within a convention. Everyone kind of got 2 ideas to throw into the Constitution. And then they finally, on day 127, came together to actually stitch the thing together in a coherent document and edit it. About 15 minutes into the process, there's a 1,500-page transcript of this monstrous convention. People start to put their hands up and say, hey, my wife needs me home. Hey, my farm's, rotting. It's not well kept. I need to get home. Hey, the per diem ran out on day 100, and this is day 127. Let's adjourn. And so they did, without reading through or editing the document even one time. The thing had all sorts of problems as a result, even just basic problems of numbering in the document, and was so problematic. That was the second of these 5 phases, that we then spent the next 60 years amending the thing rapidly, over 340 times. First with the legislature sending amendments, one amendment at a time to the voters between 1880 and 1910. And then in 1911, when we got a couple of amendments that included the initiative process, you didn't need the legislature to amend the Constitution. The voters could do it themselves. And so we, essentially in this third wave of 60 years, wrote a whole new Constitution, not in any designed way, one amendment at a time, one piece at a time. That left us, after this third wave, with a pretty monstrous document. It was decided it was too long, it had lots of things in it that didn't belong in the Constitution, so in the 1960s, there was a Constitutional Revision Commission, attempt to cut down the document. Take out things that weren't too controversial, but just make it shorter. And they got about 16,000 words out of it during that process. But then in the 1970s, with some changes in the initiative process, and a few other changes, we saw the rise of the initiative again as people were essentially able to mass produce signatures. There were political and financial incentives behind the initiatives. I can get into that more. But we saw this rapid use of initiatives. Prop 13 was one of the instigators, but certainly not the only one. And we are now in this fifth wave, ongoing, of rapid constitutional change, but not in a designed way. Just one measure at a time, one silver bullet at a time. If you just pass this initiative, Prop 30, it will save us from going off the cliff and fix the thing. And what happens? We fall for this over and over again. And essentially, we one silver bullet at a time, we've constructed a governance system. And what does that thing look like? Well, I know this is a Southern California crowd, and this is Northern California reference, but if anyone's been to San Jose and seen the Winchester Mystery House, that's essentially what we've got. We have this thing where it's not designed, it's not coherent, but it's just one thing at a time. You can build a beautiful initiative, and it makes all the sense in the world in isolation, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the rest of the house. And the house is very, very complicated. And that's the problem. There is, in that 162-year history I described, what's missing is any kind of true founding moment, any moment of actual design of a governing system. So it becomes very hard to describe what the California government is. So you imagine something that's hard to describe is very hard to govern. My co-author and I did not work, even though it's a very hard task, we decided we would attempt it. Now, of course, we did what anyone does in the narrative of the piece. We did what anyone does in the 21st century when confronted with a thorny problem, which is we hired a consultant. And our consultant is imaginary in some sense, but we thought very useful consultant. We wanted someone with a big picture, who could really sort of tell us where California fits in the universe. So we hired an extraterrestrial. We wanted someone, sort of an extraterrestrial Alexis de Tocqueville, to look at California, what all this these odd waves of change in this one piece at a time constitutional law design had given us. What was our governing system? And so the E.T. de Tocqueville went around the state and sort of reported back as follows. This is the strangest governing system I've ever seen. And I've seen them all. Nothing like it. In fact, you don't even have a system of government in California. You have three. And here's what they are. First you have an election system. It's not an uncommon election system. It's the American election system, the election system of former British colonies on your planet. It's a system that's very majoritarian. It's a system for two parties and for, you have in your legislative body, which is your main branch, you do most of your electing, and that's where you make your laws. You have single-member districts, one district, one member, and whoever gets the most votes wins. That's essentially a majoritarian system known around the world for taking even small numbers of votes and turning them into an elected majority with legitimacy. Now, you did the strange thing in 2010 called the top two. You call it a primary, that's not a primary. You ended the primaries while saying you established the primaries. You're a little bit confused. That's sort of a French souffle. That's the French system, just layered on top of this British thing. But that system, again, is majoritarian. There's another peculiar thing about its size of your system. It's very oddly sized for a state of your size. You set the number of people in your legislature at 120 back in 1879 in that convention. when there were fewer than 1 million people in California, and you could see most of them by climbing to the top of Mount Diablo in Contra Costa County and looking around on a clear day. Today, the same number of legislators represent either 36 million people, if you believe the Census Bureau, or closer to 38, if you believe the Department of Finance. You know, there was only about a 2 million person gap there. His numbers are funny. So essentially, that means that your legislators, you know, give you less representation than any people in the United States. Your individual districts have 3 times more people in them than legislative districts in any other state in the United States, and 10 times more than the national average. So if you feel disconnected from your government, if you can't get things done, if you can't get your calls returned, there's a reason for that. Mathematically, you have less representation than anybody else by a lot. That's the first system, the ET, that sort of weirdly sized majoritarian election system. Now, you elect these people in this majoritarian system, right, oddly sized, but you put them into a second system for governing, particularly governing anything that has to do with money, anything that requires money. Most difficult problems, including the oceans, you know, require money if you're going to do things. And that system operates on a completely different set of principles than your election system. Your election system is majoritarian, but your governing system is so full of rules, special mandates, tax limitations, spending mandates, supermajority rules for everything from school funding to tax revenues to making changes in the state stem cell agency. With all those sorts of rules, that kind of system, and it has its advantages and disadvantages, but that system requires broad consensus to do much of anything. Very broad consensus in the case of supermajorities. There's so many provisions that require consensus that you essentially have a system of minority rule. Now you can make the argument for the value of consensus, but as the ET would say, a consensus-based minority rule system works on a completely set of different principles than your election system. So your election system is at war with your system of legislating, particularly on fiscal matters. And the ET said that that would be among the most difficult places to govern, anywhere in the world. Just having those two systems that are really at war with each other and don't work together. It's like a computer with 2 operating systems. It's not going to work very well. But you guys don't stop there, because you have this third system. And that is the most inflexible system of initiative and referendum anywhere, and the ET is sure of this, in the universe. No place that the ET was aware of is as inflexible as initiative and referendum. Now, initiative referendum is on the rise on your planet. It's been used more in the United States, and it's being added to state and local governance systems, constitutions all around the world, particularly in places that have democratized over the last 30 or 40 years. But you're the only place where when the voters make a law by initiative, that law can't be changed except by another vote of the people. There's no amendability in the back end unless the original ballot initiative permits amendments of the measure. That's unusual. That's singular. No one else has that. Not the 23 other states that have initiative. None of these other countries that have it couldn't find it. And you're among the most inflexible in your initiative process on the front end. Lots of other places have the legislature have a role. There's room for initiative sponsors to fix errors. Here, if you want to fix error, you kind of have to file and start over most of the time, except in certain circumstances. And there's a lot of flexibility in most places for compromise between an initiative sponsor, a legislative body, and an executive body. Colorado, in recent election cycles, there have been multiple measures pulled off ballots fairly late in the process after compromises were reached. Not in California. Once those signatures are in, they got to be counted, and once they've been counted and they're enough, the thing's on the ballot no matter what anyone says. So, the ET tells us, now, you can blame whoever you want, whatever politician you want, whatever interest group you want, but it's not fair. I mean, when you have 3 systems like that work on different principles and don't fit together, California doesn't work because it can't work. It's ungovernable because you got 3 systems of government, they don't fit together. No one ever bothered to integrate or design them together. You just did this one at a time. Now, that I think is the ET story is what I buy. I think that's an actual kind of narrative of the problem that's true, complete, accurate. And the best part about it is that it actually points us in a direction other than tearing out our hair. It points us in a direction of how we can actually fix this thing. That's the one thing. The second great thing about that narrative is that it essentially sets up that the fix is we have to take these three systems, because we're going to have elections for the people we want to govern us. We're going to have to make laws and make budgets in that second system. And it's part of our tradition. It's really part of the democratic world now to have an initiative referendum. We're going to have a system like that. We suit those three things. But we have to design those three things in a way that fit together. And that's a problem of integration. And the good news about that is that Californians in areas that are involving governance are really, really good at integrating. With the exception of the Hawaiians, we are the most integrated people in the world in terms of our families, intermarriage, by all sorts of measures. We have a pretty integrated society, a very integrated culture. I mean, what other place could invent the Korean barbecue taco? Our technology and many of our industries are oriented around towards integrating, towards trade, integrating technologies. The iPhone, what is the iPhone? Collection of technologies that come from all over the world and developed all sorts of different places, designed and integrated together into something really useful here in California. We're good at this, and so that's where we're at now. I'm not always that comfortable with an actual solution, and I wanted to stop the book right there. That's the point where I ended it. But my co-author is a more responsible fellow, again, government service, and he wanted us to actually offer a solution. Now, I would say, and so I'll summarize ours and how we would integrate this. Now, I will say, we're very tied to the ETs. I'm a very strong believer and would argue with you on the ETs diagnosis being the right one for the problem. But on integration, the great thing is there are a lot of different ways to integrate the system. In fact, another part of the good news is that when you're poorly designed, sort of undesigned as California is, almost every other state and most of the world's democratic countries provide a model that if we just adopted it tomorrow would be a wholesale improvement on what we have. So it's not like if you decide to integrate, it's not like there's a shortage of possibilities or solutions for improvement. But and just very briefly, because this gets really wonky, suggest one in the book, which essentially is taking looking at these three systems, taking that first system and that majoritarian British system and making some changes to it. We tend to choose in the book things that worked well in other states or in other countries. We would move ourselves away from the single member districts that we have that are so large. We would probably triple the size of the legislature, which would still give us the largest, most populous districts. And we would make multi-member districts, bigger districts, but with more people representing them. And there would be more than one representative elected in each district. In fact, I sort of like the idea of the regions of California being the districts. They would be of different sizes, but essentially in many ways we are citizens of our regions in California. Our regions actually have the quality of states. People say often California is the place with the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world, depending on exchange rates. But a more salient fact, I think, is actually, when you're talking about governance, is that if we were a country, and that's a different speech, but there's some advantages to that. But if we were our own country, we would be the 35th largest country on Earth. And the 34 countries larger than us all have some form of state government, province, state, prefecture, what have you. We don't, even though we have these regions that have the quality of states with the same weather, rooting for the same sports teams. Our economies are regional. There's not really a California state economy. There are a series of regional economies, and that sort of having our legislature reflect that with regional districts, with multi-member districts, where we would parcel the things out based on the percentage of the vote, which is called proportional representation. You could do that a lot of different ways, and I won't bore you with all the different options. But that's the way the world has gone in proportional representation elections. So, for example, if there's a Bay Area district and had 20 legislators, and the Democrats got 70% of the vote, and Republicans got 30% of the vote in the Bay Area in legislative elections, you'd send 14 Democrats and 6 Republicans. The reason we like that is because it creates competition everywhere. It makes every vote count everywhere, even in very Republican places. Democrats have an interest in getting out to the polls, making arguments, because every vote you get in a proportional system gets you that much closer to another representative. So you really want to compete everywhere. We think regional elections sort of reflect media. They'd be covered more. I mean, people don't follow closely Assembly and Senate elections because they sort of carve us up within our regions and our alliances. We like that. The other advantage of doing that, and this is how we integrate with the second piece, is that Republicans would benefit in this way. Republicans have a much higher percentage of the vote in overall, when you look at all legislative elections in California, and their representation in the legislature. That's one of the things that the majoritarian system does, is it exaggerates the strengths of majorities to let them govern. You would think in a majoritarian system, of course, we don't have the governing system being majoritarian, but Republicans would be close enough that we think the incentives would be for them to actually compete to win back the legislature. That would give them an advantage, and because they would have that advantage, they'd be closer to having the majority. We would feel comfortable asking them to give up in that second system. We would want to get rid of all these supermajorities and a lot of these rules that give the minority party and particular interest the ability to block things, and we could say to Republicans, give these up because you have actually a chance of winning. There's sort of a trade there, and I can explicate that more. So we get rid of all those whips and chains and special rules and supermajorities, as many as we could in that second system. And if we did what we did in the first election system, we think that works together. And then thirdly, with the initiative of referendum, we would change that, make it more flexible, more amendable. We'd strengthen the referendum power, which is the verdict when we vote to reverse something the legislature does, and probably weaken somewhat the initiative power, which is an ability to circumvent the legislature. Doing that would integrate that system more with the governing system. You shouldn't be able to go around the legislature so easily and cut taxes or demand spending that creates budget issues, but you should be able to stop them when they do things. That's a more direct conversation. We integrate elections on ballot measures more with the legislative calendar. That's something we've done in this country, which is we haven't. Other countries, Switzerland is one place, Germany is one. This is getting pretty wonky, so I'll stop in a second. But they essentially integrated their initiative and referendum systems with their government and their legislative body. They put them on the legislative calendar. They have separate elections for ballot measures, separate from the candidate elections. And in California and the Western United States, we integrated initiative and referendum early in the 20th century with our election and political systems. We made them part of politics. We put ballot measures on the same ballot as these very long ballots like the one you're going to see next Tuesday with all these candidates. In part because a lot of the people in the early 20th century adopted the initiative and referendum because they were fighting big political battles, saw themselves as fighting railroads and other big forces, and they wanted these tools as political tools for fighting. They don't have to be that. But anyway, that gets pretty wonky, and so let me stop there. But anyway, that's our sort of general idea. Give people more power to vote on their representatives through our change in that first system. Give people more power to block their representatives through some of the integrating of the initiative process, but also give our legislators more power to make politics, to make decisions and push things forward in that second system. More power for both the people and the legislators in ways that they can sort of check each other more directly instead of this sort of cycle of initiatives where we get mad at something they do, we put an initiative on to circumvent them, they find a way around the initiative, we put a new initiative on. That's not as healthy. So anyway, that's our solution. But again, there are a lot of different ways to cook that meal. Just the important part is that we do integrate and do that. Now, how do you do this? Essentially what I'm talking about can't be done by initiative. In fact, times like this with the initiative process, I look at all those measures with the ballot as sort of, new rooms on the Winchester Mystery House, new dangers, new, part of the problem, part of the poison. What we need is some moment of design where we can change multiple things in the Constitution together, stitch things together in a host of different ways. That requires a constitutional convention, constitutional revision commission, or the legislature can do it under our system. Those sound big and scary. They are in some ways, but they certainly offer the possibility of improving things that an initiative by initiative approach can't do. And that's sort of the thing. Now, politically, that's very hard because even though everyone sort of knows this isn't working, including a lot of the folks who have power within the system, no one wants to give up their particular hostages. That requires a really difficult conversation, and it requires a conversation when everyone is at the table. It's a political conversation, and how do you do that? And I don't have a great answer to that, but and this is a bit of a different move in the conversation. I've been watching and studying people who try to solve very complicated, wicked problems, and in an odd sense, and this was something that I couldn't tell folks here about when I was first asked to come and speak, but I've actually been watching beginning an attempt to do this in, of all places, the Delta here in California. Over the last year, the Delta Conservancy, a body that was created not that many years ago under Governor Schwarzenegger, to essentially represent the Delta as a place. The Delta Conservancy decided it wanted to try to bring all the different stakeholders who've been fighting for years in the Delta together. They engaged 3 different people who do very complex facilitating. These people are in Northern California. I knew one of them, and I was sort of admitted to observe the process with the understanding that I couldn't fully write and talk about it until it concluded. It concluded last Friday. At least it's actually not over, but the first phase of it is, and I was released from any ability to. I don't have to shut up anymore about it. And I can talk more about it at length, but essentially they brought over the course of a year for phone calls and monthly meetings and field trips where they went and saw different things in the Delta. Pear farm, salmon fishermen, looked at levees structurally, and had very interesting conversations, again, with people who've been fighting for years and suing each other for years. There were farmers, there were fishermen, there were local elected officials from San Joaquin and Contra Costa counties. There were folks from the state, from DWR, from State Fish and Game, a person there from NOAA, a leader in the Westlands Water District, Santa Clara Water Agency, the Metropolitan Water District. Ultimately 20 people. Attendance was pretty good. There were some folks who missed. They did this mostly the in-person meetings mostly all days on Fridays. And they had these deeply conversations just to try to get them to know each other better. They ate a lot together, drank in bars afterwards together, and also to just sort of talk and try to get to a shared understanding of the problem. And I would say at the beginning there wasn't much shared understanding. They had very different stories of the problem. They also sort of had to listen. They mapped the conversation that was happening before them. Everyone had to agree that the conversation was correct before they kept going the conversation. It made it very slow, but it made everyone sort of listen to each other. It was literally on a screen in front of them. And by the end, there was a general consensus that there was actually a shared understanding of what some of the problems were. And in many cases, that shared understanding was that problems and issues were far more complicated than they thought. That the picture on levees, for example, often described as the levee picture, just a lot of levees that are ready to go down in an earthquake, is far more complicated. About half the levees have been repaired to some degree. So there's actually a great lack of knowledge about what would happen in different seismic events, just to pick one. They got deeply into restoration. And came to a consensus around the view that in these islands of the Delta, for those who know the Delta, that restoration sort of in the middle of islands, in the low-lying islands, parts of islands, made more sense than restoration, the previous focus for restoration, which had been along the levees. That it turns out when you look deeply at these farms, most of the investment, most of the highest value crops and infrastructure of the farms are actually very close to the levees. So you don't want to move levees, you don't want to have that kind of restoration. You want to sort of figure out different ways to take the middle of islands, lower lying areas with lower investment and less expensive crops as a way. They went into these issues in great detail, and I could it's in such detail that I would have a hard time explaining it here and replicating it. We could be here all night. But it was a fascinating process. The facilitators had different theories of how to structure these conversations. But it gave me some confidence that conversation, well structured and well managed, could solve a problem and get us to at least a shared understanding of the problem, of the wicked problem in California governance. Let me all but end there, but just finish with one little thought. Why now on the governance question? I mean, the levy, the delta, it's easier to answer why now. But why should we act now on these governance problems? We've had this broken constitution from the beginning. Why does it matter more now? And the answer to that is because we are right now in the process of becoming a completely different state than we have ever been in our history. We have always been in our state. Governance and our government system haven't mattered all that much, or as much as they do now. Why? Because most of us weren't from here. We got a very large percentage of our population, always the majority of our population, from someplace else, from some other state. People who were born and raised in some other state or some other country. We were the New York Yankees for baseball fans. We got free agents from other places. We didn't have to pay the costs of development of a lot of folks, particularly schools. And state government does three things. It educates and medicates and incarcerates. And occasionally regulates, though clearly not that well, as we learned. And that educate part, we didn't have to pay the full freight. We sort of lured a lot of people away with cheap higher education, but that doesn't take 13 years. You can often get away with 4. So it was a sort of cheap way for us to buy our way out of our problems, and we were a very attractive place to come for a lot of different reasons. And we had great waves of wealth and people who came here. We sort of grew past our problems. In fact, we never had a particularly great governance system. And our system has gained in complexity over time. I mean, it's gotten a little bit worse and a little bit worse. But the system didn't matter quite as much to us. But what's changing is who we are, and that is we are becoming, again, the demographer statistics differ. We either are becoming right now or have just become a state in which our majority is homegrown. That our sort of adult population that owns houses and sends its kids to schools and works, that population now for the first time is majority California, the majority of people who are born and raised here. So we're not the Yankees anymore. We're the Oakland A's. We have to find our own prospects and develop our own prospects. So our governing system being coherent and effective matters a lot more. That's one way. I think, as we saw in the first presentation, the ability to compete economically. We have more complicated challenges in all sorts of areas, also bear on the governing system. So that's why I think we're sort of at a point where we have to do this now, and we can do it now. And I'll end with a deeply serious proposal for how to do this. It's just, I think we should have a constitutional convention. And I think there should be one rule. It should be open to everybody. We want all the interests represented, but I would exclude one group of people. A minority of our population and a minority of our voting population. And that group I would exclude is men. And why? Because we had 2 conventions in the 19th century. It was entirely men, and they did a terrible job. The women deserve a chance. I like doing that, and also the politics were great. The voting population is almost 52% women. So if you get all those votes, you go through a convention, whatever product comes out of it, you get 52%, you get a majority, you win, you got a new constitution. But partly I say that to get people to think, to point back to this sort of not very proud constitutional history we have, to point us to the fact that we never built a foundation on this house of government way back in the 19th century, and to the fact that we've never really had that moment of design, that true founding, so we should have it now. Once, every state once, 160 years ought to get together and figure out what its system of government should be. We haven't done that. We've gotten away with a very long adolescence. Now is the time. Let me stop there, and thank you for listening.
I just want to add to the Delta. We want to report that all roads to California's future pass through the Delta. And I think a lot of people don't understand how critically important it is, not to Southern California, but San Francisco Bay. And it's the perfect example of a wicked problem.
Yes.
Wicked problems are, they cross all disciplines. You can't solve a wicked problem. There's no silver bullet. You can manage it with a portfolio of partial solutions that in the aggregate minimize regret. That's the best that you can do. And we never have quite gotten to that. So I hope that this process really will do something there, because it's a combination of the farming, the levees, of the development, 23 feet below sea level, the water that comes down to Southern California, the fish, and all the environmentalists want more water for, and the farmers want more water.
Very true.
And one earthquake of magnitude 7 would liquefy the levees, and we would lose a lot of houses and lives.
And offset the canals,
Yeah.
get water.
Yeah. Do you think there's going to be the modern equivalent of the peripheral canal?
No. After watching that process, which included a number of people who've been part of the BDCP, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which came out this summer and argued for these multiple tunnels, I got the impression that no. I mean, I think watching that, the clear problem is that what was called in the parlance of this, the in-delta interests, local governments, farmers, and folks whose lives were actually lived entirely in the delta, felt excluded from the plan. And by the end, there was a consensus that they had been excluded, including by some of those BDCP people, and that had been there had been time pressure in that, but that had not been a wise thing, and that they needed to be part of the process. One of the frustrations of this conversation was, these farmers were there, these local government people were there, and they were so used to being, no, I'm against, I'm excluded. There was a lot of effort trying to just get them to say in these rooms affirmatively, what are your needs? What do you want for the future? What is it that you want? And a couple of farmers, a key player in this was a farmer whose family's been farming in the Delta since the 1850s, sort of started to say that really in the latter half of that. And you could see the beginnings of a deal that included those perspectives and that could accommodate it.
The other characteristic of wicked problems is the only way that you can formulate them is by getting all these different perspectives and staying with it long enough to define the right problem.
Well, it's like bringing fishermen into the fish conversation.
Yes. And that's hard to do, though, because can you imagine running on a platform that this is a problem that can't be solved? That's not very appealing.
Yeah, no, it's not. And we had fishermen, and boy, we heard a lot of criticism of sea lions in that conversation. Fur bags, they were called, which I had not heard before. It was a very frank and full conversation.
How optimistic are you that we will move in the direction of the solution?
I am not at all optimistic. My co-author is. My co-author thinks we're living through the crisis that is going to spur this, and before we know it, we'll go because we're eliminating all options. But I'm not. I mean, I see us with these initiatives and sort of prolonging the agony. I mean, I think the stuff we're debating, I mean, my perspective on Prop 30 is, and this is not a common perspective, but is who cares? I mean, I mean, that is a solution sort of tells you we're going in the wrong direction. I mean, I mean, there's value to Prop 30 undeniably. I mean, but we have this debate about, do the politicians touch the money or not? Does it go to the schools? Well, it's money that goes into the budget. Some will go to the schools. We have constitutional formulas, a lot of formulas that may not be a very good formula, that'll take about half that money into schools. And where will that money go? Well, we've been deferring the constitutionally guaranteed payments for schools at a rate of between 10 and 20% in recent years. So actually a lot of the money will go to pay for the education that's already been provided in the last couple of years. The other thing the money does, which should not be minimized, is you shouldn't expect more school spending. In fact, you should expect more school cuts even if the thing passes. But it also will shore up the credit rating of local school districts, which is not insignificant and does save money. I mean, I would expect some districts that haven't been very good to be downgraded if this thing lost. But again, you're not solving any problem here. I mean, we have a budget system that's broken. It has the character of it's very complicated and hard to manage, but it has the character of a ratchet, and it's a ratchet that tends to ratchet down revenues and ratchet up certain types of spending. So, this thing does is it throws about $6 billion, though, that could be wildly off, given previous tax increases, into this budget mod that's expanding. It's actually, and the deficit is probably for next year already 10 billion, so it won't even solve next year's deficit. And these tax revenues are temporary. They're in sales tax for 4 years or income tax for 7 years. So it's sort of a temporary throwing in the patch. It's, you know, I mean, so, and it's tied to this trigger cuts, which are in the state budget that, you know, would trigger $6 billion cuts. It's a ransom note, but you mean, you know, people pay ransom notes. I mean, you know, you don't want people to get hurt. So it's, but it's a really, I mean, the fact that this is the choice, that this has been set up as an LBL, to me is evidence of how badly we are affected. And ultimately, you'll get big pain. The other thing the thing does that gets no notice is there's a constitutional amendments in there that lock a couple of revenue streams that currently go under law to state, to local government, into the Constitution, which again limits the discretion and the ability to balance the budget and make trade-offs in the long term. So you're getting some money up front that doesn't really solve the problem for some changes that probably make things a little harder to solve in the long term. I mean, honestly, vote however the heck you want. We're in deep trouble either way.
On some of these, I tend to be an optimist. Now, I think we're going to move forward on aquaculture. Of course, my wife reminds me that one definition of an optimist is someone who goes from failure to failure without losing hope. Who has a question for? Go ahead, guys. Go ahead. All right, Karen.
I hardly know how to say this because you went so fast, but
Yeah.
I'm from San Diego. I naively don't even remember if I was old enough to vote for Proposition 13, but just when you said it, I was thinking of that one.
Yeah.
Was that a kingpin responsible for the failure of our economics in my public schools now? And where did it fit into your level there?
It
I
wasn't.
don't want to make a mistake again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets too much blame, but in saying that it gets too much blame, I wouldn't want to say that it doesn't deserve a lot of blame. But its problems are way beyond schools. I mean, what Prop 13 did was, it's sort of the base for the new budget system. It's like it provided the sort of a base. It essentially centralized our politics and our revenues in a really problematic way. Contributed to the deficits today because when you know, before local elected officials set tax rates, that's actually fairly healthy for elected politics. It means that you know, it means that people show up, they watch their city council, they watch their school board because they can hurt them. But Prop 13 essentially took that away, said, you know, the places you can raise taxes are by 2/3 up in Sacramento, a place that you have to get on a plane to visit rather than your city council or school board, or local folks by a supermajority. That supermajority has been slightly lowered to 55% for schools related stuff, but you know, local voters can do it. The local elected officials then were left to, and this is poorly understood too, they couldn't set tax rates, so they became spenders. We deputized them as spenders. And where are the worst spending abuses in California? Local government. What on? Salaries and benefits. For whom? You know, please forgive this for being a little coarse, but public employees with penises. Cops and fire. And at the state level, we sort of reproduce this a little bit with prison guards, which is sort of a different story. That's where we are. When you talk about big spending in California, that is the area where we lead the country, and there's a huge gap between us and anybody else. That's where we're wildly out of sorts in terms of comparison. So that sort of centralization and its distortions, you know, are great. And actually, one of the stories is that left and right have kind of embraced the centralization. The left likes the sort of equality of it. It's also easy for big interest groups to just go to one place, Sacramento, to, you know, it's hard to get anything done in the system, as you discovered, but it's fairly easy to stop things from happening. They like that. And then the right, conservative folks who always, you know, are against big government centralization have sort of decided to live with that centralization because it makes it harder to raise taxes. They decided they hated taxes more than they hated centralization. And so that's kind of the stasis we're in. And Prop 13 was part of that, but we built all sorts of structures and formulas on top of that, left and right. I mean, the Prop 98 school funding guarantee is part of that. but it's all, you know, structures within this sort of broken system that doesn't make sense. I mean, since we passed Prop 98, an education funding guarantee to protect education, we've gone from the top half in spending relative to other states to very near the bottom. That's a heck of a bit of protection. You know, and, you know, I mean, we have this sense, and I think the larger critique I would make of our political culture in the state, and you know, this is, I'm getting pretty far out there, but this is, I mean, my people have been here over 100 years, so I get to talk bad about Californians, is that Californians are very impatient, fast-moving, dynamic people. They want to do things fast, and it's reflected in our lives and how we drive and how we live, and we change jobs a lot. We have a very dynamic place, and that's very good. It had, you know, our culture, economy, technology. But one place where speed and impatience doesn't work very well is in governance, which is actually has to be slow and careful. We're not good at it. We don't want to deal with all the trade-offs of politics. We prefer to just, let's pass a rule, put it in a formula, and not think about it. And that's been our way of dealing with all these problems. So we put all these formulas together, but we'll pass these formulas, but they don't fit together. So we sort of, you know, the formulas are sort of curdled into this like deranged algorithm that no one can sort of figure out, but is sort of governing the budget. And Prop 13 is like the big formula on which the other formulas were built. That's probably the best way to think about it.
Thank
So
you.
it generated, that was when on the really large number of props began, wasn't it, after
It did. There was some in the early 70s that showed it, and what really, I mean, part of it was, yes, I mean, that you could become famous and powerful in some ways. I mean, if, you know, if someone, you know, part of to say this, you know, is this is a line used by somebody else, but as horse-faced as Howard Jarvis become famous and have his, play himself in an airplane, you know, then this was a good way to get famous. But the other thing that happened is that there were changes in the system itself. It was quite hard to, initiatives fell out of fashion in the post-war era. We had political consensus, but also with the state's population rising, it took so many signatures, because the signatures required to get things on the ballot are percentages, that no one could sort of mass produce the signatures under the rules. And there was some deregulation. They got rid of something called the precincting rule, and other things. It made it easier and faster to produce signatures. There were some innovations in thinking about how to do it, and an industry developed that was more sophisticated about mass producing signatures in 150 days, and that made it easier to do this.
Who else has? Doug.
This calls for some speculation, or maybe when you want to talk about this, but it seems to me that when Jerry Brown was governor the first time, he just missed Prop 13 completely, and here we are again, all this time later, and do you draw any parallels?
Great question. I wrote a piece about just that subject for a magazine called The American Prospect in 2009, and he didn't want to talk to me about it, so I chased him down to Imperial County where he's having an event where no one is around, and then talked to him for an hour and a half about that. He doesn't feel that he's to blame for Prop 13. He said I was going to cut the property taxes, and that would have blunted it, but the legislature wouldn't go along. And then it happened, and then he embraced it. I mean, I think it's hard to blame one person for it. What I do blame him for now is nothing he's done, but what he hasn't done, which is he hasn't, if I were a 74-year-old man, just trying to do the golden rule thing, if I was a 74-year-old man with no political future and got myself elected governor of California, I would be trying to change the system, because this system doesn't allow me much room to do anything that a governor needs to be able to do. I would be talking about how the system's broken, I need to change it. I would be trying to work on that and educate people about all these things we think about the system that are wrong, because public perception is a big part of the core to this problem. But instead, he's fed the public perception, you know, fetished all these like cuts in spending that are really minor and insignificant in dollars, you know, and has sort of doubled down on this one strategy of some sort of tax deal that tides over for a short period of time, you know. When you think of, I would think, I mean, I'm not 74 years old, I hope to be one day, but you know, that would be the person who would want to take a long view, and instead he's taking this very narrow and short view, and he says this is realism, and you know, I've had this conversation, and that I'm a terribly unrealistic person. But I would say that anyone who thinks they're fixing a budget through an initiative like that, you know, shouldn't be lecturing people on this. you know? So that's sort of where we're at.
There's still hope for them, though. This summer, we had this forum on shaping the future of the Southern California by using scenarios. In one of the scenarios, this is for 2050, one of the scenarios, there's a story. Jerry Brown is back as governor. He's 100 years old, and he's dealing with these issues.
Again, he has nothing to do. That's again,
You know, it was funny, it's worth noting in this Delta conversation, one of the things that was very successful in getting these people to really together and agree is they all decided, actually in the language of the thing, that the word that we were using, there was a Brown when the BDCP was announced said, I just want to get SHIT done. That did not play well in this room because a lot of people said that SHIT is going to do it to me. And so the room basically decided to talk about the fact that, and it was sort of a joke in the thing that Jerry Brown is at SHIT. And that they agreed on, and that was part of the basis of the agreements they got to. So that was, I guess, a certain kind of leadership.
All right, we take one more and then we're going to call the meeting. Who has one question or comment they would like to make? No? All right, this was a great evening, and I want to thank both Joe and Don for a great evening. Thank you.